Olá, sejam
Hello.
bem-vindas, bem-vindos e bem-vindes
Welcome,
a
everyone.
este domingo de FLIMA.
To this
Quero começar
Sunday,
pedindo desculpas pelo nosso
I'd
atraso
like
devido a
to
problemas
start
técnicos.
apologizing. We had
Essa
some
mesa,
technical problems.
ela pode ser acompanhada
This table
pelos
can
áudios
be
originais
seen
ou
listening to the
em
originals
português.
or in Portuguese or in English.
Links estão no vídeo.
The
Então, se
links
você
are
quiser
available in the description of the
acompanhar
video
com
if
o
you want to
áudio
follow
inteiro em português,
with the
basta
full audio in
clicar
Portuguese.
no respectivo link,
Just
e
click
a
on the
mesma
link
coisa se aplica ao
and the
inglês.
same for English.
Meu nome é Roberto Guimarães, eu sou
I am Roberto
curador da
Guimarães.
FLIMA,
I am the
Feira
creator
Literária
and
Internacional da
curator of
Mantiqueira.
FLIMA.
Esta é a nossa segunda edição,
This is our
100%
second
online.
edition, 100% online, and today,
Ao contrário do que eu costumo fazer, que eu apresento as mesas e daí as acompanho, hoje eu vou ter a honra de mediar essa conversa.
Today, I will have the honor of mediating this conversation, which will bring two authors
muito potentes que têm
of very strong novels,
a gente vai poder conversar aqui.
Which we will be talking about here. So I'd like to call, first of all, Kamila Shamsie.
Boa noite para você, Kamila.
Good evening, Kamila, to you.
Good evening, Roberto. Nice to be here.
É prazer recebê-la, Kamila.
It's a pleasure to have you, Kamila. Kamila has already been to Brazil about 2 times.
Yes, I've been to Paraty and Rio, and I wish I were there now.
Sabe que a gente também não se importaria em estar.
We wouldn't mind to be in London right now. Kamila Shamsie was born in Karachi, Pakistan, in 1973. She grew up there. She is the author of 6 novels, among them Burnt Shadows, which was shortlisted for the Orange Prize, and it was published in Brazil by Alfaguara. In 2013, she was chosen as one of the best young novelists of England by Granta magazine in 2013. From these 6 novels, the one that was more, that had a trajectory that was more impactful was Lar em Chamas, which was released this year by Grua, with this beautiful cover, which is the same cover as the English edition. And Lar em Chamas, whose original title is Home Fire, was selected for a prize in 2017. The South Asian Literature Prize, and it won the Women's Prize for Fiction in 2018. So we're going to be talking about Lar em Chamas with Kamila tonight. Thank you very much for your presence tonight. Also joining the conversation is Nara Vidal. Good evening, Nara. Good evening to you.
Good
evening, Roberto. Good evening, Kamila. So nice to be here. Thank you for the invitation. We thank you for your participation. Nara also lives in London, but she's in Portugal. She is speaking from Cascais, right, Nara? Yes, I am in Cascais. I'm not really doing anything, just writing, so it's very nice. How long are you going to be there in residency? 2 months here. I arrived at the end of October, and I'll be here until December. Nara is from Minas Gerais, from Guarani. She has a master's from the University of Rio de Janeiro. In 2001, she moved to England. She spent a short time in Italy and basically in London since, where she continued her studies. There's something very interesting about her trajectory. She also writes for children. Maybe some of this experience about writing for children has its impacts in this novel, this extraordinary novel that is Sorte, which was published in 2018. It was one of the winners of the Oceano Prize. Nara writes chronicles, short stories. Sorte was her first novel. Now she can celebrate. She was shortlisted for another prize with a short story, a book which was published last year by Faria e Silva, which will launch a new edition of Sorte, which was published by Moinhos from Minas Gerais, like Nara. Nara is also the editor of Capitolina magazine and a translator and columnist of newspapers. It's a pleasure having you both here. I'd like to start our conversation listening a little bit about your trajectory as writers. Maybe starting with you, Kamila, who was born in Pakistan and grew up in Pakistan. I'd like us to tell us a little bit about at what point did you find yourself a writer? How was your trajectory in this discovery up until the point where you started publishing your books?
Well, I grew up in a house where the sound of my childhood was my mother's fingers on the typewriter and then a computer, because she was a journalist and an editor and a writer. And I'm sure that played a part in the fact that I knew very early on that I wanted to write. Books were always the great love of my life. And apparently I was 9 years old when I declared to my parents I would be a writer. By 11, my best friend and I were writing novels together because our dogs had died. So we wrote a novel about dog heaven. So really, I've been writing since I was 11. So it's, in some way, I'm doing the thing that I loved to do as a child. But I went to university in America, studied creative writing. And the novel I wrote in graduate school was my first published novel. So it's a kind of disgusting story because writers are supposed to have a hard time and struggle a lot. And things happen, I had a lot of good luck and met a lot of the right people along the way. So, now I'm it's been 23 years now since my first book was published. And I found it's true, the thing that people told me early on, which I didn't believe, which is it gets harder and harder the longer you do it.
Vai ficando cada vez mais difícil,
It gets
né?
harder and harder.
E nessa sua trajetória,
so in your trajectory, Blood in Chamas, Home Fire,
definiria este livro?
How would you define this book? For people that haven't read it yet, could you say that? It would be nice to hear from you. How would you define it?
Well, one of the ways of talking about it is it's a rewriting of Antigone, which is a 2,500-year-old play. But I always start by saying you don't need to know anything about Antigone. It was there for me in the book, but the book exists on its own. It's a story of two families in London. They're both families whose parents or grandparents migrated from Pakistan to Britain, but they are all Londoners. London is the city they've grown up in. One family is a very influential political family, and the other family is really the opposite of that. So there are three siblings. Their father died on his way to Guantanamo after being captured in Afghanistan. So they grew up very much feeling themselves and their family at odds with the British state. And the youngest member of that family, a boy, goes to join ISIS in 2017. And really, it's about the repercussions of that, which his sisters face. And then one of his sisters becomes involved with the son of a very important politician. And so those two worlds, the political family and the family on the wrong side of the law, they come together in a story that is a story of family and of love, but also of politics and violence and the state.
Ele foi publicado em
The book was published
2017,
in
certo?
2017, correct?
Yes.
E quando que ele foi escrito? Porque ele traz bastante
When was it written? Because it brings a lot of
da temperatura política
the temperature, the political temperature,
contemporânea.
contemporary political temperature.
It's a book that got written very fast. So it was published in 2017. I started it in really between late 2015 and mid 2016, it was written. So a lot of these things were happening in the world as I was writing. When I was writing, ISIS was still a very militarily strong state. By the time the book came out, fortunately, their military might had gone, but other things were happening. Like one of the central characters in the novel is this politician. He has the position of Home Secretary. And he's from a British Pakistani family. He's very conservative, very, makes a point of being particularly anti-migrant in a certain way. And then exactly such a character became Home Secretary in Britain some months after the book was published. So it felt in some odd way contemporary even after it was published, and things were happening that were mirroring the book.
Sem dúvida. Quem acabou de dizer boa tarde para vocês e para todos é a Maria Valéria Rezende.
Maria Valéria Rezende is welcoming everyone and saying good evening. Maria Valéria Rezende is the author being honored on this edition of FLIMA. Nara, I also could talk about Sorte, which has several enchanting characteristics, I would say. It's a word that has to do a little bit with the universe. But tell us, for people that still hasn't read your book, first, how did you find yourself as an author? And after that, how does luck enter the scene? A little bit different from Kamila. It took me a while to find myself as an author. I think that in my case, I'm still finding myself. I don't know. I had a childhood very marked by a tradition in Minas Gerais. A lot of stories passed down to me. I was always interested in listening to stories, even before reading. Books entered my life in a very timid way. My parents were both teachers. We were a family that owned books and had books at home, but it took me a while to be interested in reading. I was always interested in stories, but it took me a while to read. I think I was really bad in math. I entered literature, Portuguese history, and the university I chose was humanities. From that point, I was already interested in languages, in literature. It made a lot of sense to me at that time. I thought about journalism, but there was something about literature that I knew I wouldn't be able to manage with journalism. So I went to do humanities at the university, and the teachers were also authors, and I was interested in literature more and more. Despite studying languages, literature started becoming more important and taking more space in my life, beginning in college. And there I started writing a little bit that I didn't show anybody, happily. But I started having this desire to write until I was published. I started imagining a published book beginning from the writings for children. And I started writing for children because of my children, because the oldest was learning, growing up in an environment with two languages. In that process, I thought it was so curious, so interesting. And so I started writing a few books, some stories based on that experience. Her experience, who was learning two languages, and myself as a witness. So from that point, I was published. I presented this project to a publishing house. I was published, and from that point, I started writing. Every time I wrote, I had in mind that it could be published because I already had that experience. I don't write for children anymore because I think the fountain has dried up because they're older, I think. I don't feel the motivation to write for children, maybe one day, but right now, how old are they? My son has 10, my daughter is almost 13 years old. So the moment is gone that I wanted to write for them many books. Always based on their own stories, but now I think that the ship has sailed. I'm on a different phase. I'm investing a lot of time writing for adults. Short stories, chronicles, novels. It's a very interesting experience. I like specifically in this field. In your residency there, are you developing a project and a specific project? What's going on? I have no commitment to present any project, and that's very interesting about this residency, because it's a literary residency where I can stay 2 months in Portugal. There's no pressure to present a project at the end of it. This ends up being it's something that motivates me creatively to write, because I don't have that pressure. I have a space that's all mine to write. I have space, time, so I'm at a place that has a lot of motivation, a lot of stimulation, museums, art galleries, and so on. So I have my time, I write, but the project that I decided to develop during my residency, there are 2 projects: a novel that's going to be released next year, and another project is a book. I don't know that I can call it an essay in a traditional way. It's a book I like to be a little less academic, but it's a book talking about some interpretations about Shakespearean characters who are women. So I classified 13, 14 of them, and I'm developing the interpretation for these women from several readings. But I don't want it to be highly academic. I like to make it more popular. I want to popularize Shakespeare. I teach Shakespeare, and I think, well, would it be difficult? Can I do that? I like to change the idea that Shakespeare is difficult. There are difficult approaches, but there can also be something easier and still deep. And that's what I'm trying to develop right now. Before we talk about sorte, if you allow me, since you're talking about Shakespeare, let's bring a little bit about, Kamila talked about Antígona, Sophocles.
Trazendo dramaturgias de peso, né? Kamila, qual que é a sua relação com Shakespeare?
Kamila, what is your relationship with Shakespeare's women?
I have a very intimate relationship with Shakespeare, who's one of the first loves of my life. So Nara and I should have another session where we just talk about Shakespeare. I think I was about, for some reason, I was 9 when I, first got to know Portia and the Merchant of Venice. And that, it's interesting, the reading you do as a child sticks with you. And so Portia is one of the sort of central literary characters of my life. I just love the idea of, even though I didn't know the term cross-dressing woman, something in me even then loved the idea of this cross-dressing woman who was going and fighting this legal case. And the novel I'm writing now actually has a lawyer in it. And as I'm writing, I'm thinking, oh, it's quite possible that somewhere the roots of this character came from reading Portia at the age of 9.
Muito legal. E agora, falando pouquinho desse seu romance,
talking a little bit about your novel, Sorte, that was published in 2018 and will be published again with a new edition by Faria e Silva, as we mentioned earlier. Tell us a little bit about the book for people that don't know, and how would you summarize it in a short few words, this great little book, because it has only 100 pages. Natalia Timmerman, who's a writer, she said something once. She said that the book was a mixed book, and I thought that was right on the spot, this classification that she gave. I thought it was interesting that she said that, because it's a book about movements, migration. For people that don't know, it's a book that the story starts in the 19th century in Ireland, with this trajectory of an Irish family that travels to Brazil. It's a rare occasion that Irish people travel to Brazil, but it really happened. It was unknown to me. I researched, and it was very interesting. It took me 6 years to write this book, but it was a book that gave me great pleasure investigating. I love history. It was the moment to study, to research. It was very pleasant. The research was very pleasant. The family leaves Ireland, Catholic, and they go to Brazil. And when they arrive there, the family breaks apart for several reasons. The brothers go to war. The mother dies during the trip. One of the brothers goes to a convent, and the main character, Margaret, she becomes pregnant during the trip. She has a child. Because she is single at that time, the nuns take her to a place called House of Shame. There, they give the children away to Portuguese families who have money and are willing to adopt and buy the children. So I took this idea about a historic part of England and Ireland, which was exactly this period. And we still have some of that today. We read many news about that. The fallen women that were Catholic and were adopted by the nuns. We hear many news about children that went to live in Australia, but they were kidnapped children by the nuns and taken to other countries. Exactly because of moralism and religion. It's something that I also wanted to develop in the story. So basically, that's that. It's a story about mixed ethnic about immigration, about enslaved women.
Fala muito sobre o Brasil, né, Nara?
And it says a lot about Brazil, right?
Bastante sobre o Brasil. Acho que é
A lot about Brazil. I think
uma metáfora
there's a metaphor, a powerful metaphor that crosses the book.
Você pode falar pra gente um pouquinho depois, né? Essa ilha mística e tal.
There's this mythical island.
Enfim, uma história contada em família.
It's a story told in the family, but I think they're talking a little bit about a lot about Brazil. You say you spent 6 years working on this project. At what point did you, in fact, ended the story? Because I think it captures the sensibility in these political movements, even the contemporary ones. Sometimes I think, well, after 6 years, I have to put a period in this book. I think the crucial thing was initially this novel. I can classify it as a novel because it's short. This novel would have a story only about Ireland, this journey. After I went to Brazil and I found some documents, that's when the link that was missing in my head, it was exactly this 2 women who left their countries in different ways, different reasons, on account of the documents that I found about enslaved women in Minas Gerais. Is it close to Guarani, your city? Close to the river. Exactly. So really in the book, there are several references to Guarani. The last part of the book, there are several references, names given, old names that I bring it to the book. It's really a part of the book that references real parts of the city that I come from. And I think it worked that way. I put an end to it. I developed that end. Once I found those documents of the enslaved people, from that point on, I could finish the puzzle. I knew that the story had to end in Brazil, but with this finding, with the documents, I could, in my head, finish that arch, that story, and put an end to it eventually. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Now, I'd like to ask, before I ask Kamila to read a passage of Home Fire, she will read some, I want to make a comment, which is pertinent, Kamila. Maybe you are aware, but in Brazil, we have a very reduced knowledge about what it is. What is Islam? What is to be a Muslim? What is Pakistan itself? I thought it was funny a little bit because there are several passages, very good humor in your book, a very refined humor, especially in dialogues. There's an interesting moment. One of the characters, Isma, she says to Iman, that he was a Google Pakistani. He had to go to Google to find out the references about his own culture. He travels between the being a Muslim in London, how a family that embraces that and another family that does not embrace that. But here in Brazil, we have very little knowledge about this reality that happens in London. So, with that comment, I'd like you to read a passage of Home Fire, please.
Thank you. I'm going to read just from the beginning, so I don't have to explain it very much, except it's important to note the start happens in London, at Heathrow Airport in London, and Isma, who's the character we're speaking about, she's never lived anywhere but London. It's her only home, so she's grown up there, and she hasn't. In fact, she's visited Europe, but this is her first time going on any long distance flight, and she's about to go to America. Isma was going to miss her flight. The ticket wouldn't be refunded because the airline took no responsibility for passengers who arrived at the airport 3 hours ahead of the departure time and were escorted to an interrogation room. She had expected the interrogation, but not the nerve-wracking hours of waiting that would precede it, nor that it would feel so humiliating to have the contents of her suitcase inspected. She'd made sure not to pack anything that would invite comment or questions. No Quran, no family pictures, no books on her area of academic interest. But even so, the officer took hold of every item of Isma's clothing and ran it between her thumb and fingers, not so much searching for hidden pockets as judging the quality of the material. Finally, she reached for the designer-labeled down jacket that Isma had folded over a chair back when she entered, and held it up, one hand pinching each shoulder. "This isn't yours," she said, and Isma was sure she didn't mean because it's at least a size too large, but rather, it's too nice for someone like you. She said, "I used to work at a dry cleaning shop. The woman who brought this in said she didn't want it when we couldn't get rid of the stain." She pointed to the grease market on the pocket. "Does the manager know you took it?" "I was the manager." "You were the manager of a dry cleaning shop, and now you're on your way to a PhD program for sociology in Amherst, Massachusetts." "Yes." "And how did that happen?" "My siblings and I were orphaned just after I finished uni. They were 12 years old, twins. I took the first job I could find. Now they've grown up. I can go back to my life." "You're going back to your life in Amherst, Massachusetts." "I meant the academic life." I'll stop there.
Maravilha. Muito obrigado pela leitura.
For your reading.
E daqui a pouco a gente.
And in a little bit, I think I can take the opportunity about this reading.
Pouquinho adiante, existe
there is
diálogo.
A dialogue that I think is very significant for the book as a whole.
Que assim, enfim, ela é interrogada ali, né?
She is interrogated at the airport, right? In that context, with the terrorist attacks and
toda a parte de viajar, voos internacionais era algo que estava
international flights were something very complicated.
E ainda mais você tendo a pele não branca,
even after
bem claro,
not having a white skin, of course.
E daí chega
so
homem que vem devolver
a man arrives to return the passport to her, and he asks, "Do you consider yourself British?" The man asks, "I am British, but do you consider yourself British?" "I lived all my life here." She wanted to say that there's no other country where she could feel a part of, but the word sounded evasive. So, to consider oneself British, which permeates the whole novel, how does that work for you, thinking about in the characters and a little bit about your own experience, your life experience, because you arrived in London? How old were you?
So my story and relationship to Britishness is very different to the characters. I didn't become British till I was 40 years old. I moved to Britain when I was 34 I became British when I was 40. And in a strange way, for me, actually writing this book made me feel much more a part of this country, of Britain, because it was the first novel I wrote that was really about Britain. Isma's is a completely different story because she is born and grows up in Britain. She's never been to Pakistan. And what I wanted to do with that conversation is slightly turn inside out a kind of conversation that goes on in Britain about people whose families at one point were Pakistani, which is there is always this question of, are you really British? And what I wanted to do with this book a little is to show, for someone like Isma, the question is so strange because, of course, she's British. What else is she? And that it's not her who doesn't feel British. It is other British people, in this case, a white British person whose family has been there for generations. It is that person who looks at her and thinks, are you really British? Because she doesn't look British. She covers her head. She wears a hijab. Her name is a Muslim name. And so it's not that she has a crisis with her own Britishness. It's that other British people have a crisis with considering her a full citizen of the state, even though that is what she is.
Perfeito. Nara, agora a gente quer ouvir trechinho.
Now, Nara, I would like to listen to an excerpt from Sorte. Let's bring Nara here to the conversation.
Obrigado. Vamos ouvir trechinho de Sorte.
Let's hear an excerpt from Sorte.
Esse trecho da segunda parte do livro.
It's from the second part of the book.
Página 39 e 40.
Pages 39 and 40.
Bati tanto na Marta que arranquei
I bit Marta so hard I put out a chunk of her hair in a fit of anger and betrayal. At the dinner table, Marta said she saw me with my legs spread open in the ship's cabin looking up while Orlando shoved his head in between my thighs. Father in a wheelchair and burning with hate told James to get up and beat me. James slapped me across the face, striking my nose. He did not manage to do much more. Mary and Monica were sobbing, leaned against the chipped edges of the table, shabby like our family. Daniel wanted to do the honors. He removed his belt and whipped me as if he wanted to kill me. Martha would jump like a stray goat, like a 2-year-old child. She would jump and laugh, jump and scream and cry. That sick girl betrayed me. My happiness garnered no mercy from her. It was thrown in the middle of the dinner table like an indigestible dish. The amount of violence in our home that night was no greater than my humiliation. I bled from the neck, from the arm. I lifted my dress so Daniel could whip me. He ordered me to remove my underwear so the strikes would hit where they should. He grabbed a wooden spoon and struck me in between my legs. Monica would scream for clemency, asking us to remember our mother, but Father would command Daniel to continue. Decency should be restored in our home, if not by example, from punishment. She who did not live by the commandments of God, who did not shove her legs even as a 24-year-old, even living only to make jam nobody would buy, was worthless. She would go to the depths of hell, cursed and wretched, a fallen woman. May the devil take me. I remember having spent the night sleepless, Mariava applying compresses on my body, shamed at every inch. My Negro knew how to heal wounds. She would apply compresses on herself, on Dolores, on her brother, on the little Negroes who would escape from the farm to see the horizon beyond the guava tree. The day I don't smell blood or wounds is the day I'm dead. I know that life is business as usual because I live with blood and pus splattered on my frock. It's a very strong passage where this scene takes place. Would like to point out that Daniel is one of her brothers, and that this relationship between Margaret and her siblings. It's one of the very interesting points, the way that you work that in the book. I think that we have there a first point of contact that I would like to bring to the conversation between your books, which is these families in conflict, these families in convulsion, I would say. So how, Kamila? Well, we can talk to Nara first. This family, this dynamic, the dynamic of this family, what can you tell us? What is? It's a relationship of these women, 4 women and 2 men, who follow different paths. 2 of the women end up having a less unhappy fate, I would say. How was the construction? What's the dramatic weight of this familial relationship, which is in the middle of the novel? It's precisely based on religion. In this case, Catholicism, which is something that I had already decided on, especially in relation to the babies that were kidnapped and taken by the nuns. In Ireland, in the fiction as well, I created a place of shame. It's fictional. It didn't exist as far as I know. So these familial relationships were based on religion, on Catholicism. And it's interesting because when we think about these families leaving Ireland, being Catholic with his children, and going to Brazil, Brazil becomes a fertile terrain to continue this faith, all this exercise of Catholic faith. And all of that I wanted to show with the book. It's exactly this moralism, this relation, this strong, all this relation, misogynistic, based on the Catholic religion. Women have polarized characteristics. They're worthless or they're sanctified. So I wanted to play with that, developing this fiction based on these concepts, which in reality, they are concepts which I grew up in Minas. I grew up as a Catholic up until I was a teenager, also because I was never questioned about anything else. My mom wasn't a Catholic. My grandma was a little bit indigenous. There was nothing like that, but on my dad's side of the family, they were all Catholics, and that played a big role in my upbringing. So I wanted to bring that to the book. Some of those vestiges that I would like to identify. So I amplified that. We're talking about a different time, 19th century, but it's interesting how some things are still possible to think about nowadays. I think that's scandalous. Sorte has this relationship with a contemporary, despite being so old, but also on account of religion oppression, repression, moralism, judgment, prejudice. I wanted to bring all that, but it's very strange how this can have space still nowadays.
Sem dúvida, eu acho que é uma das potências.
Yes, no doubt. I think that's the root of your story, this resonance, this reflection, and what it causes. One of the reasons why I thought it made a lot of sense to put you two together in the same conversation, I think Lighting Chamas, Home Fire has a lot of that. The families in two families, as Kamila told us in the beginning, they have conflict, and the relationship with religion is also very relevant. With all the tradition of a family, a Muslim family in a contemporary London. I'd like you, Kamila, to comment a little bit about that, the families and the relationship with their tradition.
Well, one of the things I knew I wanted to do was to talk about a range of experiences. You know, people talk about Islam as though it's one thing when there are a billion Muslims in the world. And so I have 5 characters, and they have very different relations. So the politician is an atheist who very much deliberately sets himself apart from Islam and says that has nothing to do with me anymore. His son doesn't even consider the word Muslim as connected to him in any way. And then in the other family, you have Isma, who is very devout, and for her, religion is a source of strength and support. There's her younger sister, Anika, who wears hijab, says her prayers, won't drink alcohol, but actually, in terms of belief, there's very little sign that she has of anything other than outward belief. And in her actions, she never thinks of religion. It doesn't affect the decisions she makes in her life. And then there's their brother, who, again, is not particularly devout, but he gets caught up in a political version of Islam and gets drawn to the way that Islam is used to political ends by people who are recruiting for ISIS. So there are these very different kinds of relationships. And above that all, they are all living within a Britain which is suspicious of its Muslim citizens. And in different ways, they have to choose how to respond to that. So it's these complicated, different relationships to Britain, to Islam, and to each other, because of course at the heart of it, it is a story of 2 families, and how in a novel, of course, everything is about how these abstract ideas become personal details and what they do when 2 people are in a room together interacting with each other.
Sem dúvida, eles interagem muito,
no doubt they interact a lot
com diferentes,
with different, as you said so well, with different perspectives in relation to Islamism.
Uma coisa que me chama, e isso é uma das
something
uma das preciosidades do livro, porque permite,
one of the precious things of the book, it allows the Brazilian reader to, in general, that is not familiarized, it allows them to dive in this universe with different points of view, and that's very rich. The very choice of every character, they have chapters, it contributes a lot for that. It's a very happy, formal choice of yours. Something that I think is very interesting is how you place things in your novel. This first contact after childhood between Isma and Imam happens in the United States, right? by chance, it seems like, and then other chances get to start happening, and this is very, it's very well constructed. How this chance end up conducting you in building this narrative. And the question, when you sit down to write, do you already know what's going to happen, or do you like the story to guide you?
It's an interesting question. Usually I sit down to write a novel with very little idea of what's happening. I have a few images. Quite often I know the last line, but I don't know what it means or how I'll get there. And I write and I make lots of mistakes and take a lot of time and go down paths that lead nowhere and have to come back. With this one, it was different because I was basing it in part on Antigone. I had a sort of skeleton of a story and an outline. So this felt like a very different writing experience to the other books that, of course, I had to think about in what ways I would adapt it to a contemporary London. But there were a lot of things I knew about who the characters were, what their relationships were, what the main elements of plot were going to be. And with Isma and Amon, I'm glad you bring up that point about them meeting in America. They're both from London. But one of the things I knew was that they were from very different worlds in London. And anyone who has lived in a big city knows that there are people, if you have come from very different kind of class backgrounds, if you come from different worlds of socializing, you can run into each other and you'll see each other, but you're from different worlds and you barely even look at each other, and you just move on. And I needed them to have a conversation. I needed a friendship to start, maybe a romantic interest, which would then lead Amon, in fact, to Isma's sister rather than to Isma herself. And I thought the one way of doing that is to have them meet outside London, in fact, outside England. Because in America, rather than being two Londoners from different backgrounds, they were the only two Londoners around. And they see each other, they hear their accents, and they're both a little bit homesick. And they start talking in the way they would never have done if they had met at home.
Isso é precioso. E você falou, né, de quem mora numa
very
cidade
precious.
grande.
You said people that live in a big city and
vivendo em espaços menores, né? Tem
living in smaller spaces. That there's a part in the book where he says that his friends lived 4 kilometers away, his relations, because he's in Notting Hill, which is a high-class neighborhood, opposite to Wembley, which is a neighborhood of immigrants. But there's this well, my friends are in a radius of 4 kilometers.
Eu acho que ainda falando enquanto a Nara voltou, que bom que você voltou, Nara.
Oh, Nara, you're back. Good.
Tem também outro.
There's also
acaso,
another.
Né? Vamos chamar de acaso, que é o momento onde
there's another chance, which is the moment where their brother, who ends up being a character who becomes a protagonist by the end of the book, there's a scene, a final scene. This romance, I'm not going to tell what it is. I recommend it strongly because it's a very powerful story, but the moment that his fate crosses Islam is also provoked by an encounter by chance.
E efetivamente roubando celular dele e tal. De novo, acaso ali, né? Pouco.
So there's chance there a little bit.
There is. I mean, I think so much of life is made up of chance encounters, and it's this curious thing that you have. I think very often, even in the important relationships of our lives, we realize we meet someone and we could so easily have just walked past them. We could so easily have not asked a question that led into a conversation that led into a life together. and these little moments, you realize how easily something could not have happened. And yet, because you had that one conversation, because someone recognized something in you, some tiny thing happens and your entire life changes because of it. I mean, our lives are very dramatic and we don't think about it because we're so used to it. And it's only when we see it in a book, we'll say, oh, that's such a coincidence. Oh, that's, an extraordinary chance. And yet it happens all the time to us. It's how it's the narrative of our lives is the moments when those chance encounters become something enormous or lead to something extraordinary.
E quando eu identifiquei
when I identified
essa característica,
this characteristic, I
na
started thinking about
Auster, né, que é uma coisa que acontece
Paul
bastante
Auster with something that happens
nos livros dele, né?
in his books. This thing about exactly what you said. You just said this chance that can change everything at a certain in a certain circumstance, just like in real life, that can change everything. Do you identify a special taste for a narrative like Paul Auster's, or is not something that's not?
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, Paul Auster is a wonderful writer. What's not to admire in him? I mean, he is such a thoughtful writer, and you can feel this enormous brain at work, and you can feel someone who is so interested also in plot, and in how things happen. I mean, that is basically, I think, what novelists are so interested in. How do things happen? What happened here? What went on? It's so easy. When you write, I think one thing you become aware of, particularly as you go through many drafts, I mean, you as readers see the final version. And our hope as writers is that everything in there seems inevitable, as though one thing led to another. But of course, when you're working through it, you're experimenting with different versions where something very different happened. And then you change one detail and the whole story swings around. And of course, that is also what happens in life, although it's almost as if in life it's too terrifying to think about. It's only in fiction we can think about it, because if we thought every day we went out and thought, if I choose whether or not to cross the road now, that could change the shape of my life. It would make us insane to be aware of the possible weight contained in every moment. So we do it in fiction instead.
A literatura de boa qualidade traz isso, né?
Great quality literature brings that kind of stuff. Nara, I asked Kamila, how much does she know about her own stories before writing them? In your case, how does that work? Do you like to discover during the process of writing, or do you prefer to sit down and write already with a clear idea about where the story is going? Oh, yeah, we're having a little bit of connection problems. We'll keep going. Kamila, tell me something. Do you, growing up in Pakistan, living in the United States for a while, now you're in London for a few years, what's your relationship, your identity? Because I think that your novel brings a lot about that. To question oneself, what it is to be British, what it is to be Pakistani. There's a passage that I think is very interesting when he arrives in Karachi. Actually, he calls his cousin, who is in Karachi, and he says, I am a Pakistani, you're just Paki. So I think there's this grades of what it is, in fact, to be a Pakistani. Someone saying that still lives in Pakistan, which is this character that doesn't show very much, but in a very significant way in the book. There's a guitar player in Pakistan. What are these grades? And you having been born in Pakistan, how do you place yourself in this multicultural, having traveled to America? Tell us a little bit about that.
Unlike the characters in the book, my relationship to places is very uncomplicated. And I think maybe it's because I grew up in one place. I had such a strong sense of identity as being from Karachi, that then I could be someone from Karachi who went elsewhere and found another home as well. I mean, I don't know why people feel they have to have a very monogamous relationship to the idea of home. I am happily a bigamist. I have London and Karachi, and I think of myself as a Londoner and a Karachiite. And I suppose what is common there is these are both big cities, and I really think of myself as someone, rather than saying I'm British, I'm Pakistani, I feel much more comfortable saying I'm a Londoner and I'm from Karachi. And there's something that big cities have, and I when I went to Rio, I felt it. When I go to Bombay, I feel it. That if I'm in New York, I feel it. That there is some quality of these big cities which are terrible and wonderful, and all kinds of things happen there, and all kinds of people land up there. And there's something familiar. Cairo, I felt it in. Beirut, I felt it in. There's something that feels familiar to those of us who recognize these huge, sprawling urban spaces as our place. There's a recognition in them. And so London and Karachi to me feel like overlapping cities in a lot of ways. And I live in an intersection of both of them.
Nara, sua conexão tá estável agora?
Desculpa, eu peço desculpa, gente. Eu perdi um tanto que a Kamila disse e, enfim.
I apologize. I heard a little bit about what Kamila said. Technical problems, well, it happens when we do it live. It happens.
Tá falhando de novo, eu peço desculpas, eu não sei o que está acontecendo,
So,
tá falhando.
I apologize, I don't know what's happening. Can you repeat, Roberto, what you said? I'd like to know, do you prefer to sit down and write knowing what's going to happen with the story in details, or do you like the story to guide you? Can you hear me?
Não,
yes.
Eu ouvi o que a Kamila disse em relação a isso.
I heard what Kamila said about that.
Geralmente eu vou às cegas. Eu não planejo tanto.
Well, I go into it blindly. I don't plan too much about what I'm going to write. It's interesting because many times people plan.
Eu não sei, eu não consigo muito bem fazer isso.
And I don't know, I can't do that. But luckily, because Sorte had several historic references, there's something in the novel that you have to know about what you said, so you don't make any mistakes, and you have continuity. So I remember something interesting in the beginning. I said that the main character, she didn't know how to read. Later on, she showed up reading something, so I had to organize that, so that all this structure ended up giving me the possibility to trace it back, not to make mistakes. They're important and useful, but usually I go at it blindly, not knowing how it's going to develop and how it's going to end.
Até para poder ser surpreendida pela história, né?
So you can be surprised by the story, right?
Comigo pouco assim.
Eu acho também que tem uma dinâmica diferente. Escreve conto.
There's a different dynamic when you write a novel, when you write short story. A short story is really I go
Então,
into it
geralmente eu
blindly.
começo um conto sabendo como que ele vai terminar.
Usually I start
Romance, não. Romance,
knowing
eu
how
não
the
sei
short
bem
story
como
is
que vai
going to
terminar, eu
end,
geralmente
but with the novel, I don't
junto com a
know
história.
really well how it's going to
Mas no
end.
conto não, ele tem uma dinâmica diferente.
I usually
já começo
follow along with
sabendo
the
como é que eu quero
story.
que aquela história termine.
It has a
Talvez seja mais
different
importante pra
dynamic.
mim
With the short
terminar
story, I already know how it's going to
término de um
end.
conto
Maybe
do
it's
que o
more
início.
important to me to finish the story than to know the beginning.
Você estava falando mais importante o término do que o início.
You were talking about that the end is more important than
Para escrever conto
the
é mais
end.
interessante para
I
mim
think that to
saber
write
como
a
ele vai
short story
terminar
is more interesting
do
to
que como
me
ele
to
vai
know how it's
começar.
going to end
E
than how
no
it's going
romance
to
não, já o
begin.
início o
And with
ponto
the
mais
novel,
interessante. Desculpa, a internet está
the
horrível
most
hoje,
interesting part is the beginning.
desculpa
I'm
mesmo.
sorry, my internet is horrible.
Não,
Please
acontece.
forgive me.
A gente também
Oh,
fez
it happens,
testes
Nara.
antes, estava tudo em
We
ordem.
tested before, everything was
Tem
fine.
instabilidades que podem acontecer.
There's instabilities
Também.
that could happen. We understand
Vou
totally.
aproveitar que você está conectada e acho que tá
So
bem
now that you're
conectada,
connected,
tem uma ideia que é bem
there's an
presente
idea
no seu livro, e
which is very present in your
aparece
book.
aqui, dessa coisa do Brasil como uma fantasia, né?
This thing about Brazil
Tem um
as
determinado
fantasy.
momento onde
And at a certain
que
point,
o Brasil nunca deixou de ser uma fantasia. Claro que tá
Brazil
dentro
has
do
never stopped
contexto
being
do
a
He Brasil, né,
fantasy,
dessa
which is
ilha
in the
mítica
context of the He Brasil, this
encantada.
mythical island.
Ixi, ela caiu. Acho que não. Vamos
Oh,
voltar para Camila aqui.
she's disconnected.
Camila,
Let's go back to Kamila. Kamila,
você,
do
em
you,
termos de literatura,
in terms of,
acho que tem uma, assim, no Brasil, né?
in Brazil,
A gente tem uma dificuldade
we have
de
some
inserção
difficulty
internacional por conta do idioma, né? O português não, ao contrário
on
do
account of the
inglês,
language,
ele não é
Portuguese,
uma língua
English
dominante, né?
is not a very dominant language.
Qual que é o seu contato com a literatura?
What is your contact with literature that's done in other countries, and
gosta de ler,
what do you like to read? What can you recommend for people that are listening to
não tem
us
acesso aqui no Brasil.
for things that we don't have access to here in Brazil?
I mean, I do start by saying that I'm incredibly grateful to be translated and published in Brazil. You know, it is one of the things when you start writing a book, you never imagine that you're going to be read in all these countries and different languages, and that there are these different versions of you that will be out there. I mean, you know, I'm not entirely sure what the book is like in Portuguese. Maybe it's better. Sometimes I think, you know, maybe the translations of my books are better than the original I wrote. Who knows? And I wish I could read them all. What should you be reading? I mean, you know, one of the writers who I've thought is really wonderful for about 20 years since I first started reading him, and not enough people were reading him, was Abdul Razak Garna, and then he won the Nobel Prize this year. And I know that in a lot of countries his books aren't available, so I don't know if there are editions in Brazil. He's an extraordinary writer.
Ainda não. Devem estar aparecendo em breve.
Yeah, they probably will be available soon.
Eu não queria ter te cortado.
Nara back. Let's get her while
I'm sorry,
can.
I didn't mean to cut you out.
Acho que a gente não vai conseguir a Nara.
I think we're not going to be able to talk to Nara. Oh, what a pity.
Mas tem uma cena no seu livro, Camila,
there's a part in your book, Kamila,
forte,
especially strong. There's a parallel with a scene from what Nara read from her book.
Que é aquele momento que se aproxima, embora seja num ambiente familiar, né?
The moment where, despite being in a familiar environment,
De toda aquela violência, e tem uma cena de
all that violence, and there's a torture scene also in your book, which is very strong and very significant to make the story keep going in a very ingenious way. I'd like to know How was it to write this part? Did it involve a lot of research? How was that? How did that work?
Are you talking the one where Pervez is in the flat with...
Isso.
Yeah.
Onde há as correntes e tudo, né?
And it's a scene in which this young man is being brainwashed, radicalized. You can call it what you want, depending on how you see it. And I very much want to leave it to the readers to decide how they see it. It's almost embarrassing to say that it was a very easy scene to write. But I suppose one of the things is when you write something, before you write, you do a lot of reading and you do a lot of thinking about it, so that somewhere inside you're working these things out. And sometimes it just happens that at the moment you go and sit down. But that one actually surprised me. I didn't know what I was writing in that scene. I started to write it and it kept going of its own. And I'm not sure where it came from, which is a little bit disturbing. But part of the reason I wrote that scene is, when I started the novel, I knew very little about how young men from Britain who were living a certain kind of life ended up going to join ISIS, to this just horrific organization. And I had certain assumptions in my head that these are the kind of men who are drawn to violence. And so they go for violence. And it was actually fascinating to do some research on the kind of propaganda that ISIS was using, particularly in the early days, to get its recruits. And what I discovered was that a lot of the propaganda wasn't about violence at all. I think later on they were using more violence, but in the early days, it was things like sense of belonging. You come to this place, this will be where you belong. Come to this place and you won't have to face racism. And there was I think a lot of the subtext was, come here and be a real man. And I think that was what I was investigating in there, is what does this mean for this character, to be a real man? In what ways did he feel he wasn't being a real man? What was he failing to live up to? And the torture scene becomes in some way part of that, because it's something his father has endured. And in this odd way for him, it becomes a way of feeling close to his father, to know my father was tortured. I'm now experiencing something of the same as he does. And it's a very twisted kind of psychology, but it also, as I was writing it, made complete sense that this would be something that he would think and go through.
E sabe que a cena, embora forte, faz todo sentido.
The scene, despite strong, makes a lot of sense. It makes sense when you said that it was easy to write because it flows so well. But I think that what draws the attention a lot is the role. That moment in history, there's a reversal of expectations that makes the story keep going. So it ends up being tortured, and then he decides to join them. It's very very strong and very well developed. Let's see if Nara has some sort of stability. Nara, it's something that doesn't depend on us. Internet is very bad right now. I apologize. I'm so sorry. It happens. Let's take the opportunity then to bring a question, it's a question from Maria Valera Rezende. Let's start with you, Nara. The question is, religions and prejudice are what produce injustice and oppression, or is the exploitation and domination systems that co-opt or appropriate religions to take hold of the exploited from within? Maria Valéria asked me that. It's the system, obviously. There's no doubt about that. In my book, Sorte, for instance, I wanted to explore more than the idea, not to place villains, the churches, the religions. It's not exactly that. In the case, it was to expose exactly the fragility of some people when they follow certain religions. That's what was more interesting to me, the fragility. A system that has a lot of deficiencies, inequality, all these questions that end up hopes and these gaps, the fragility of people that follow certain religions. So to me, that was more important, because this family in Sorte that leave Ireland and go to Brazil, this family their base is Catholicism, but is an oppressive family. It's a very unhappy family, a family that lives in a way that
muito fragilizada dentro dos próprios sentidos, dentro das próprias crenças. Então, eu acho que claro, casamento perfeito, né?
I think that's the perfect marriage.
E as grandes diferenças sociais,
the big social differences, the gaps, the injustice, the social injustice, things come together and one feed off the other. I think that there is another point, another passage in the book that brings up the matter, the racial question. And it's very resourceful how this Margaret's daughter ends up having the company of a sibling who is a Black person. I think it's very interesting how you build that, how
toda essa questão do contexto mesmo, né, dessa cooptação.
All this question of context and the forces, the oppression, how they end up in fact sealing the fate of the characters. The two children that end up as siblings, they become siblings. Mariava will end up taking Margaret's child with her. And the children end up growing up as siblings. One is white, the other one is Black. And they say that in the book. And Sorte being in a book that is mixed. I think it explains very well. It's Brazil. Because you have, it's very interesting the relationship that they have and the relationship that other people from outside of this relationship have. Everybody, people can see that there is love, there is friendship between them, affection. They are siblings, but the way people look at them, there are passages in the book, in the third party, it's a little bit like Kamila said. It's a problem. The problem is the other person's has a problem. The problem is theirs. This question about identity in England, which is something that can be explored. We can talk about that for hours. But this question of identity, belonging in a country where I have my beefs about that, and I think about what is it to be British, but in relation to the book, specifically these two boys, they're not anything else but Brazilian. They were born there, but people that deal with them, they have these problems in relation to, they question the peaceful relationship they have together, a white and a black. And there's no conflict between them. They love each other. They are accomplices, they are partners, they are friends. And the people around them, they have conflicts in relation to that. Some characters will suggest that the white one follow his wish. It would be interesting for him to distance himself from the black one, the characters around them. They are very concerned about perpetuating this question about where they should be. So it's something that I try to develop from these two characters that are already Brazilian. We have Mariava, who's the daughter of enslaved people. She has connections with Africa, but the two boys, they are already born in this place where there is a mixture, which is Brazil. The relationship between the two of them is seen as something very problematic, but for them, it's something so innocent. There are many passages in the book, and the way that you narrate them is very resourceful. But there's a part, Mariava, the two boys are growing up, and at that point she can't see anymore. I'm not going to say what happens that she can't see anymore, but that was very precious for the development of the narrative, because they grow up with different colors. In her relationship to them, there's a passage that I'm going to read that talks about Mariava. She says, Negro Mariava was more indigenous than the Negro. She lived in an indigenous tribe. And Emmanuel lived. It was love they talked about when they didn't realize the color that they were. I think that summarizes well what you were saying. Yeah, this question, what you said, this sensorial, it was important for me to develop it. She becomes blind, and she identifies the children by the hands, by the shape of their noses, by touching their hair. They don't realize that. They don't realize the differences. Because they have never seen anything different, anything other than that. So when they are questioned, when people try to separate them, they don't understand that. So when they realize that they can follow different lives, where the Negro is going to be enslaved and the white one will have the opportunity to study, have a different life, opportunities and privileges. They organize themselves so they can stay together, and they end up dessas personagens brasileiras, né, que não sabem muito bem a sua origem, miscigenadas, né, que não sabem as histórias, não sabem de onde vêm, they don't know where they come from precisely. For me, it was very important in developing this book, this lack of information about our own identity. Sometimes we have information we have information about certain parts, but not about other parts. We're all of us Brazilians are like that. We belong to a country that did not give us the opportunity to understand our own history in a fair way. So what's left is these gaps that we try to fill in. No doubt, very well said. There's this aspect about the color of the eyes. There's a direct link to this beautiful story, this bedtime story that starts there in Ireland. Well, there's a time where there's no mirror, the person doesn't know what they look like. It's very potent that people that we live with mirrors, we don't. Some people could spend their lives without seeing themselves. It's really, in the end of the book, you actually talk about that. The story about people with no past and no future. This lie that is still called Brazil, something that you were talking about. Yeah, it continues to be. So let's ask the question to Kamila also. Religions and prejudice produce the injustice and oppressions, or the exploitation and domination systems that co-opt or appropriate religions to dominate the exploited from within.
Guerrilheiros, né, enfim, nomeados terroristas dentro do Estado Islâmico, né? Como é que você vê?
Yeah, talking about the terrorists within the Islamic State, how would you see that?
Yeah, we can't hear you.
Sorry, it's not always that easy to separate the religion from the system, and because it for so long now, religions have been interpreted by certain powerful men. It's very largely these religions are talked of in a certain patriarchal way that creates a system of oppression, and it's very hard to talk about what is originally there, what is essential, what has been added on. But what I will say is, within the novel itself, you see a woman, Isma, who is able to use, for her, religion is strength and support. That is what she takes away from religion that is important to her. And then you see through her brother, he is someone for whom religion is used as a tool of manipulation and power to devastate his life. So I want to show that it can work in both these ways. There are so many people, I think, for whom religion is the one thing that keeps them standing. It's the one thing that gives them solace. It's the one thing that gives them hope. And how do you balance that against? I don't think you balance it. I think you say there are these different ways of encountering religion. And there are some people for who, they're born into a version of their religion that is punitive. And that limits them. And there are other people for whom it's a very different kind of thing.
Sim. Yes. Nesse sentido, tem uma passagem.
In that sense, there's a passage in the book.
Talvez eu li primeiro
I read it first with Kindle in the original language. And then the version in Portuguese Beta, who is our interpreter, forgive me because I didn't tell you about this passage first. It says, a man would prefer to go fishing with his friends than to chop off the heads of his enemies, but it was necessary. I think that this passage, this is very, very humorous. It has a lot to do with what you were talking about, don't you think?
Yes, I mean, it's, that idea of what is necessary. I mean, you and I would hopefully, I think, say it's never necessary to chop off anyone's head. But you can belong to a very different world and see things quite differently, while also saying of yourself, I don't want to be doing this. I'm a person who would rather be living in peace. I would rather be sitting with my friends having a good time. But the world's injustices are forcing me to act. I mean, I did want to also show that Pervez very clever people are figuring out how to say exactly the right things to convince this boy to come and join ISIS. And I didn't want him to be a boy who's drawn to violence. He isn't. And when he does encounter it, he runs away from it. And yet this boy who has no violence in him, but does have anger, does have a sense of failure, does have certain grievances, he gets drawn into this most violent of worlds by this kind of logic that sometimes it is necessary to be brutal because that is what the world has forced us to do.
Por isso que eu trouxe essa passagem, porque acho que ilustra bastante bem isso. Bem, a gente está se encaminhando para o final dessa conversa. Eu gostaria de pedir para você, Nara,
se tiver
alguma questão para a Kamila.
If you have any questions for Kamila.
Nara, você está com a gente?
Nara, are you with us?
Nara, acho que com áudio tá, né? Legal. E se caso não tenha essa pergunta para Kamila,
if you don't have a question for Kamila, if you have final considerations, yeah, I'll be happy to hear a question.
Gostei muito de ouvir da Kamila essa questão da identidade, do pertencimento.
I loved what Kamila said about belonging, identity, as a British that she brings to the book.
Temos aí temos essa questão muçulmana, mas temos também
we have the issue about Muslims, people that are descendants from immigrants from the Caribbean. We have all this question of immigration, belonging, this thing about identity. What is it to be British? It seems like the British, in the sense of mixing, it's starting to look a little bit more like Brazil, so many identities. I thought that it was very interesting what she said. The problem that some British have in relation, this mixing, I think that's progress. It's an example that we're moving forward. It's something very interesting that to me, it's what we would like to see happening. So to me, it's very interesting. As an immigrant myself, to me, it's something very precious, very important. What she said made me think a lot about. I always think about that, but to hear it from her, it helps. To give it a boost. Thinking about immigration. To say that I am British, it still takes me by surprise. Maybe I don't feel like one. I mean, I've been there for 20 years, but I always feel like I'm in the middle of the way. I feel Brazilian, of course.
enfim.
But always I feel a little bit like an
Lugar
outsider, not belonging to the place where I am. So I'd like to thank this thing, the things that Kamila said.
Agradece as suas colocações aí.
Thank you about your
Como é que
considerations.
esse lugar, né, de brasileira,
This condition as Brazilian, this displacement,
enfim, impacta a sua forma
how does that
de escrever,
affect or impact the way that you write?
Eu acho que é assim,
I think that
meu modo de estar, na maioria das vezes, é um modo de estranhamento, né, de território.
the way that I feel is this estrangement. Sometimes I feel that I don't belong anywhere.
Tantas modificações no país.
Sometimes when I go to Brazil, I see so many changes, especially now. It's a country that I don't recognize most of the time. It's strange going through such deep trouble. So there's this estrangement in relation to that.
E existe diariamente estranhamento.
But there's also daily estrangement for being in England. I live with British people, but
sempre falando português,
I'm always speaking Portuguese, always trying to
no meio do penhasco para não cair, né? Que a minha própria língua. E não faço concessões.
Always trying not to lose my language.
Por exemplo,
so
eu não acredito que eu vá escrever.
I don't believe that I will write. They say never, but I don't think I'll ever write fiction in English, for instance, because, in fact, I'm Brazilian. I'm a Brazilian author, and so that's what I managed to have from this complex identity as a Brazilian. In Portugal, for instance, there are other questions that I am Brazilian, supposedly speaking the same language, which is not the same language. So this belonging, language, this is it's very present in my daily life. I don't see it as a problem. I see it as something rich, a challenge. But I think that's that.
Esse estranhamento me parece
This estrangement seems to me
mais do que bem-vindo, né,
more than welcome to a writer, right? And Kamila,
gostaria de ouvir aí suas considerações finais, caso você tenha
do you have final considerations? Do you have comments or a question for Nara, please?
Oh, I think it's so fascinating to come in to hear Nara's relationship to Britain, and I think we need another session. We need one session on Shakespeare's women. We need one session on Britain and what it means to be from different places and come to Britain. I mean, with Pakistan, it's in some ways so far away, but there's a long colonial history which creates certain kind of connections. And I'm always interested in how the relationship is different depending on what your historical relationship of your country is to Britain, and also the language, because English is my first language, so there isn't a language question for me. So it's just so interesting to hear you talk about being in London but living in a different language in some way, and I'm interested in I think it's fascinating to know how that works. But my real question to you, Nara, is, can I read your book in English?
Well, unfortunately not. Não, olha, Kamila, ainda não, mas eu...
Not yet, unfortunately. Sorte is not translated into English yet. I hope it'll happen soon, but not yet. But I have a lot of published things in magazines.
Latin America Literature Today, mas esses são os contos, mas
the short stories.
Sorte ainda não tá, mas quando
tiver, but Sorte, luck, is not translated yet, but when it is, I will send it your way.
Espero que ele esteja.
I'm going to start Googling you as soon as we get off, so I can find that of your work, which I can.
E vocês que moram na mesma cidade,
You who live in the same city, you end up meeting up, getting to know each other.
Durante a FLIMA.
And during FLIMA,
essa então é a penúltima mesa da FLIMA. Amanhã a gente tem a mesa de encerramento com
tomorrow we will have the last round table.
E talvez seja último encontro literário.
Maybe it will be the last literary encounter before he becomes the first indigenous author, part of the Brazilian Academy of Letters. It's an extraordinary feat, especially in the political moment that we are experiencing right now. So now, this is our invitation for the conversation tomorrow. I'd like to thank very much your participation. Kamila, thank you so much for joining us, for your time, for this beautiful book. We hope that it will have a beautiful trajectory here too, with the Brazilian edition. And Nara, thank you so much for your presence. And don't be sad about the connection problems. It happens to everyone. A pleasure being with you. I apologize once again. It's very uncomfortable when that happens. It was a pleasure to talk to you, Roberta, to listen to Kamila, to get to know her. I'm always following you. Thank you so much for the invitation. I loved it. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone. Good evening.